Good morning. On this Saturday, we will look at today's reading plus tomorrow's reading. So we look John 1:29 through all of chapter 2, and that's a lot. What we begin with, it says the next day. John saw Jesus coming toward him. So the first day, John had been baptizing. Then the next day, he sees Jesus coming, and again he says, "Here is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. This is the one who I said, the one who ranks ahead of me because he was before me." So John testifies to Jesus as, the Son of God. And, and he talks a little bit more that way. And then verse 35, the next day, John again was standing with two of his disciples. And he saw Jesus walk by and again exclaimed, "Here is the Lamb of God." And those two disciples heard that and they began to follow Jesus. And they talked to Jesus, or he asked them, "Well, what are you looking for?" And they, their question, "Well, where are you staying?" I mean, what kind of a question is that type deal? But he said, "Come and see, follow me. Come on over and visit." And one of those was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. In other Gospels we have Andrew and Peter, fishing, and Jesus calling them here. John has a little bit of a different take on the disciples, but Andrew invites his brother Peter to come and see, Simon Peter, and who becomes called Cephas, and which is Peter as well. And then the next day, in verse 43, the next day Jesus decides to go to Galilee, and he found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." And Philip goes to find his friend Nathanael and says, "We have found the Messiah. It is Jesus of Nazareth." And Nathanael's response, and Nathanael and Bartholomew are most likely the same person. "Well, can anything good come out of Nazareth?" And Nathanael was from Cana, which is, like 7-8 miles from Nazareth, and it was kind of some of that rivalry of one town against the other that way, and we understand how those things go. But again, just come and see. That's Philip's invitation to Nathanael. And when Nathanael comes, Jesus recognizes him, knows him. When did you get to know me? Well, I saw you sitting beneath the fig tree. And we wonder about that. But things become more clear as we get into the chapter 2. But so we've had the baptism, and then the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and then chapter 2 begins with on the third day. I don't count the same as that, but that's okay. But on the third day, Jesus went to this wedding at Cana of Galilee. So, he had returned to Galilee. So he was there, from Jerusalem, or from, the River Jordan where the baptisms were. And he'd returned back to home, and he went to a wedding. And we know this story. The wine gave out. His mother says, do whatever he tells you, and the water becomes wine. And these ceremonial jugs of water, it wasn't so much for washing for sanitary reasons, but it was ceremony. And, Jesus talks to the religious people later on in different times about, following ceremony and tradition rather than God's instructions that way. But so this turning the water into wine is the first sign. And, John records 7 signs, big miracles, we could call them, although there are many smaller ones as well. So verse 11 of chapter 2 says, Jesus did this, the first of his signs, and his disciples believed in him. So, how many disciples did he have at this time? John doesn't really tell us that, but we got Andrew and Peter and Philip and Nathanael, so there's 4 of them there that are, have been mentioned. And after this, he went to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there a few days. And this is, then Capernaum becomes Jesus' home during his times of ministry. And then verse 13, it's the time of the Passover is coming near. So this is the first of the 3 Passovers that Jesus attends. And he goes and he finds the selling of the temple, the sheep and the money changers and all of this stuff going on in the temple. Well, he's been there many times before, but things are different now. And because he's come into his own, that way. And, as like with the turning the water into the wine, Jesus has said, my time is not yet. But with that first miracle, that first big sign, Jesus had come into his time. And his time concludes with the resurrection after his death on the cross, of course. But he cleanses the Father's house. And then verse 18, the Jews said to him, and of course, here the word Jews is capitalized, the religious leaders, what sign can you give us for doing this? They wanted signs, they wanted wonders, they wanted proof of something or other. And, you think about signs. I mean, we have signs all over the place, but, these signs, and, well, just hold on to that thought for a minute about signs. I want to, and then it's destroy the temple in 3 days, but talking of his death and resurrection. In verse 22, after he was raised, his disciples remembered that, and they believed the scriptures. And then verse 23, when he was in Jerusalem during the Passover, many believed in his name because they saw the signs he was doing. And I think about, this is what I, ask you to hold that thought in your minds, because of the signs he was doing. So we've only been told of 1, well, and the cleansing of the temple is 2, and, speaking to the religious leaders and stuff. But it reminds me of, somebody, being best friends with somebody else as long as they're paying for things, as long as they're supplying things. They all wanted to see the signs and the miracles, and they all wanted to benefit from this other person. And then, when I read this, it made me think of the song "Nobody Cared." And in that verse, as long as the miracles flowed like wine, they called him wonderful, and they came to dine. And then it's that but when tough times came. So this is, during all of the signs and all of the miracles, there were many people that were clamoring around Jesus. But when the signs, and Jesus knew, and this is what John tells us in these last couple verses of today's chapter 2. But Jesus, on his part, would not entrust himself to them because he knew all people and needed no one to testify about him to anyone, for he himself knew what was in everyone. And, there's oftentimes we read that, Jesus perceived what they were thinking in their hearts. Jesus understood what was going on. I mean, and here John tells us that, Jesus knew what was in everyone's heart. I mean, this is God, all-knowing, all-powerful, all-present, And so Jesus, being God, knew what was in the hearts and the minds of these other people. And he knew then that many of them were just, following for the signs. And it's like when he feeds the 5,000, they're there the next day. What are they looking for? Another free meal. And that's kind of, the mentality of so many today too, keep giving, because we're going to take everything out of you that you will give. And Jesus knew what was in these people's hearts. He knew that some of them were believers just because of what they saw.